Get over to Twitter.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Focal Points. Today, our special guest is Dr. Kunadhasan, and as well, we have Dr. Peter McCullough, and this is a McCullough Foundation sponsored episode. And so Dr. Kunadhasan, you have uncovered a lot of things regarding Pfizer, specifically within their trial, or you've uncovered that there's been more deaths. They buried deaths, and there was autopsies that weren't reported on, or that weren't conducted, and so and they've been delaying. They delayed trial results back in 2020. So why don't you tell us, give our audience a brief background about yourself, and then we'll dive into these shocking revelations.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, and Dr. McCullough as well. My name's Jeyanthi Kunadhasan, so I'm an anesthetist and perioperative physician in Australia. Now, I got fired over COVID-19 vaccine mandates because I asked my previous employer to justify the risk of taking this versus the risk of getting the disease. Like, I'm an anesthetist, I know respiratory diseases, and so they didn't want to listen to me. I got fired. And when you're working full time and then suddenly you've got nothing, you're wondering what do you fill with your time. There was a call out for volunteers to actually read the papers, that the documentation that was part of the emergency use authorization of the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine. So I answered that call, and I'm part of that group of volunteers. That's why I have I can actually have these findings. So these people have to understand the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine was approved on the results of one trial. There's extensive documentation about all the patients in this trial. There's 44,000 patients who entered this trial, and the documentation relevant that the FDA looked at to approve this vaccine is more than 500,000 pages. It's publicly available on the PHMPT website. But an ordinary person can't read it. One person can't read all of this. They needed a team. And what happened was we were looking at the discrepancies between what Pfizer actually presented publicly and what was going on beforehand. So in the first place, the reason that I can actually present on this is I'm part of the team that did a forensic analysis of the subjects that died in the Pfizer trial. So we have to understand when the Pfizer trial has been reported in the literature, it's been reported twice. In December 2020, it was approved. At that time, they said there were 6 deaths. And 6 months later, they said there were 38 deaths. So this is what we critically evaluated was the subjects that died in the trial. So that was I'm part of the team that did the first peer-reviewed paper on it. So what you have is my slide, Nick. Why do a forensic analysis of this 38 subjects that died? And the reason is, remember I said there's 500,000 pages out there that it's very hard for one individual to read. If you go to the publicly available documentation, that is all that we would have to know about this trial if we didn't have that 500,000 pages uploaded. So basically, they said at this point in December 2020, there's 6 deaths, 2 in the vaccinated group, 4 in the placebo. And they said there were no deaths considered by the investigators to be related to the vaccine placebo and no COVID-associated deaths. So that's basically all that we would know about the subjects that died in this clinical trial up to that point. Basically, that paragraph that I've highlighted.
Now, Dr. Kunadhasan, I've got a question for you. With that information, I've been on FDA advisory panel teams. I've been on lots of work groups. We get ready at the US FDA at these meetings. We have the core slides, which are the slides that the Pfizer would put together, and what's called the briefing booklet. Well, there's
Absolutely.
always a data cutoff date in order to prepare these booklets, right? So the trial is ongoing. When was the data cutoff date, and how much time elapsed before the meeting?
So what the data cutoff date for this trial at that time period was November 14th, 2020.
Oh. So,
all right, and I can tell you why it was November 14th, because that will be relevant to the second half of the presentation, the 170 patients. So this trial, as we know, the Pfizer COVID vaccine was said to be 95% effective. The data that said it was 95% effective out of a trial of 44,000 was only actually based on 170 patients, and the 170th patient was found on November 13th. So that's why November 14th was the data cutoff date. And then Pfizer.
Let me just say, I can tell you for FDA procedural reasons, from the time of the data cutoff to the time of the presentation, there's a period of time where more deaths can accrue. And so the first question that as a panelist, if I was on the panel, the first question I would have asked them is, have any more deaths occurred since the time you put together the briefing booklet? And are those deaths included in the slides? And I've looked at this carefully. It looks like no one on the panel asked Pfizer that question. No one at the FDA asked the question. And then Pfizer didn't volunteer the information. So the panel was reviewing data up to a cutoff point, but deaths were still accruing.
Absolutely, because people have to remember this trial was still ongoing. Because I've mentioned that it had emergency use approval in December, and then they had a 6-month data period, and that was the second time that the data in this trial has been reported. It actually went on for 2 years. We haven't had any more data. So this slide, Nick, is, and it'll be more clear, Dr. McCullough, what you're talking about when we go to the next slide. But this slide is literally, I want people to understand, I've taken this from the FDA booklet, basically what was presented. I'm not making this up. So this is what was presented. They said at this point in December 10, there were 6 deaths, 2 vaccine, 4 placebo. And in the vaccinated group, they said one had a cardiac arrest 62 days after dose 2, and the other one died 3 days after dose 1, and it was atherosclerotic disease with baseline obesity. And if you actually look in the notes, this patient was about the BMI was only 32. The patient was only 100 kilos. So if you really go into the weeds, a lot more unravels. But we'll go to the next slide.
But let me say, as a cardiologist, those 2 deaths in Pfizer, knowing what we know now, they would be easily classified as vaccine-induced deaths.
Absolutely, and a lot more.
Yeah, the vaccine causes myocarditis and heart damage. It also accelerates atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So there's no way that the investigators, looking back now, could have ruled out the vaccine as the cause of death in the vaccine group. But what about the 4 deaths in the placebo group? Were they similar?
So they were not sudden cardiac deaths. They were not deaths that happened suddenly, but so they didn't have that description. And I don't actually remember fully the manner of their death, because I have been quite focused on the sudden cardiac deaths, but it wasn't as dramatic as the 2 deaths described.
Okay.
Yeah. So basically, this is our peer-reviewed paper where we analyze the 38 subject deaths, and that's across a period of 6 months. But let's go back to November 14, 2020. That's the data cutoff date, and that's around the 16-week period of this trial, because the trial started on the 27th of November. And remember, they said that there were only 6 deaths. And if we count the deaths as they occurred, according to the arms of the trial, vaccine and placebo, and when they occurred along the time period, what we can see is the number is not 6. Up until November 14, if we count the lines, it's actually 11. So we have a problem here where deaths are occurring in the clinical trial and they can't keep up with reporting. Because what was publicly disclosed was 6 deaths, and it was actually 11 deaths.
But so is it 11 deaths up until the time of the meeting?
So it's 11 deaths up until November 14. So I'm trying to report things basically as they reported. And if we go to the next slide.
Oh no, let's stay on this for a second. Hang on.
Okay, yeah.
So it was 11 deaths before the data cutoff. They just didn't have them come in. They didn't get reported in yet. They had occurred.
But
right?
They had occurred, yes.
But it takes a while. People don't understand when someone dies, it takes a while for somebody at the clinical trial site to ultimately figure out they died, because many times the relatives don't know they're in a clinical trial. So they wouldn't know to even report the death, right?
Absolutely. So basically, if you look at the trial protocol, if anything serious happened, a serious adverse event, of which death would be the most serious adverse event, the clinical trial was supposed to inform Pfizer no later than 24 hours immediately, and no longer than 24 hours. So within a day, Pfizer had to know that there was a clinical death in this trial from the clinical trial site. So if we think about it, if you have an adverse event, you can tell the clinical trial site you have an adverse event. But if you die, you're dependent on someone else telling the clinical trial site you've died. So we can only, what I'm saying is that we can only say that these deaths were hidden if we have documentation from the patient's relative informing the clinical trial site they've died. Mm-hmm. Because if, according to Pfizer's own trial protocol, once the clinical site was informed of the death, they had to tell Pfizer no later than 24 hours.
Right, but I want people to understand that, let's say if somebody's in the trial, they've received Pfizer or placebo and they die, and they said they die at home, and the body is taken to the funeral home. You know, the relatives start going through the paperwork, going through the belongings, and they see a consent form. Said, oh my gosh, they were in the Pfizer trial. Then the relatives would have to, call the study center and say, listen, I want to let you know, a couple of weeks ago, my relative died and it looks like they were in the study. So there could be a lag from the time the death occurred in reality to the clinical trial center knowing. The clinical trial center then has an obligation to report that within 24 hours. But the data cutoff had already had, they were in the process of doing what's called a soft lock. A soft lock means it's not completely locked, but they've got to get to a point where they can get this clinical study report done for the briefing booklet. And in that rush, it sounds like your point is instead of 6, there were really 11 that should have been in the core slides in the briefing booklet. So let's hear about that 11.
Yes, and in the first place as well, let's just look at this a bit more clearly as well. This is deaths as they occurred in the clinical trial along a time period. So the first thing we can see, so the more solid line is the vaccine group and the other group's the placebo. And we can, at the point when the trial was blinded, we can see that the vaccine was not life-saving. It's not like those in the vaccinated group are dying much less than those in the placebo group. Though what was presented made it seem that way because it was 2 vaccine, 4 placebo. So even though the numbers were very small, it seemed to give, if you're a lay person, you're pretty reassured. Like it seemed to, you're at least it looked like half your chance of dying because the vaccine was only 2, isn't it? And the other thing to look at, what we found in the forensic analysis is the number of deaths that were reported in the 6-month period, the 38 patients, was actually 17%, 17 expected deaths of a population this size and age. So it's only 17%. And a lot of it could be explained by loss to follow-up. There was about 400 patients completely lost to follow-up. So we don't know. And I'm not speculating because I don't have the paperwork. But what we can say by looking at US actuarial data, which was how it was calculated, the number 38 was actually only 17%. So there's a lot of missing pieces in this, and that's one of the things that I want to bring forth as well.
So
And
are you saying to this day, even at the very end of the study, there's 400 patients lost to follow-up, they don't know if they've died or not?
Yep. And if you look at it, if you look at the some of the documentation is like they tried to call the person 7 times, and they just no idea what's happened.
And they were probably dead.
But let me.
So
let
I
me
don't
just
say things that I can't prove.
Right. Let me say from a clinical trial perspective, and I've been involved with large cardiovascular clinical trials my whole research career. 400 patients lost to follow-up is completely unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. And companies nowadays use all kinds of third-party vendors to figure out if somebody is still alive or dead. So believe it or not, they can use all kinds of strategies to see if they're still getting their mail or responding to their mail or out shopping or what have you. But to have 400 people lost to follow-up, completely unacceptable. And what that does is that takes away what's called robustness. It's a very important point. So let's say you have just a few deaths in each group. Well, if you have 400 lost to follow-up and 300 died in Pfizer and 100 died in placebo, now we'd have a massive difference, and it could swing the results one way or the other. That's the reason why it's so important.
Absolutely. And if we just go to the next slide now, I just so remember a lot of when you're looking at the Pfizer documentation, you have to go through what was what Pfizer presented publicly and what you find really happened. And that's what this slide is. So 6 deaths was presented publicly in the journal article and the FDA approval meeting, but actually 11 deaths happened. And look at it, there are 6 deaths in B and there are 2 deaths in the B and T group, but there were actually 6 deaths in the vaccinated arm. Of the 11 deaths, at this point, if they had presented the deaths accurately, right, it would have been that you're more likely to die at the data cutoff date than from the vaccine than the placebo. The numbers are very small, but it's not persuasive.
Right, and what did those 6 deaths look like? Were there 4 more cardiac deaths?
Yep. So basically, if we go to the next slide. Now, what I want, the first 4 patients in the vaccinated arm, and this information is found in our peer-reviewed article. The first 4 patients in the vaccinated arm were adults found dead. All right. If they had reported the data accurately, the first 4 patients in the vaccinated arm were people who found dead. Now, if we look at the point of the data cutoff, the shaded areas are the vaccinated people who were not reported publicly. And what we find is that there's something going on in the reporting mechanism between vaccinated and placebo. Because in the placebo arm, there are 5 people who have died before the data cutoff, but they managed to report 4. And that's an 80% reporting rate. But in the vaccinated arm, 6 people have died. They've only managed to report 2. That's a 33% reporting rate. Something is not correct in the reporting of the vaccinated deaths. And as I said, we can only go after them if we have documentation in the patient's folder that the patient's relative has informed the clinical trial site of the death. So what we have is for 2 patients of the vaccinated deaths that occurred, we don't have documentation as well for the other 2, but for 2 of the vaccinated deaths that occurred before the data cutoff. This is not after the data cutoff and before the meeting. This is before the data cutoff. We have documentation that patients' relatives called the clinical trial site when they died before the data cutoff, and somehow once that information reaches the clinical trial site, within 24 hours, that's supposed to go to Pfizer. So somehow that reporting mechanism hasn't happened. And it'll be more clear once we go to the next slide. So this is the subject that is the that should really be more famous. So this is a 63-year-old woman in Kansas. She signed up for this clinical trial. She was in the vaccinated arm. She received 2 doses of the drug, and she died on the 19th of October. Now, I have written everything relevant to this patient in a letter to the Attorney General of Kansas, Chris Kobach, and I will give you links. So that has all the relevant screenshots of what I'm presenting in this slide. Okay, now the subject died on the 19th of October 2020. And now remember, this is before the data cutoff date of November 14th. The key thing is whether the emergency contact informed the clinical trial site of the death, and they did on 19th of October 2020. Now look what happens. In the clinical trial site, in spite of documentation saying that they were informed of the death on the 19th of October, the clinical trial site only enters the death on the 25th of November. So this is now after the data cutoff. But it is this is some of an event that happened well within the reporting period, isn't it? And the thing that's most concerning about this patient is the day. So I have obviously gone through this patient's case report form. And what I looked is the day before the EUA meeting, there's an update in the safety database and said the cause of death is sudden cardiac death. So do we retain it as unknown, or do we just say sudden cardiac death? Now, if you think about it, Dr. McCullough, of all the diagnoses in the world, why would you pick sudden cardiac death and put it in this patient's case report form?
Well,
this patient had an autopsy.
Well, let me just say there are what's called the Utstein criteria for sudden cardiac death, which means somebody's in their usual state, there's no premonitory symptoms, and then boom, there's a sudden death, and there's strict categorization. So we use the sudden cardiac death term. We know exactly what we're talking about, and we know the vaccines cause sudden cardiac death. Nick Hulscher and I have published extensively on that.
Absolutely, and I've cited your work as well in my letter to AG Chris Kobach. But this patient actually had an autopsy. It's very clearly written in the patient narratives that this patient died, had a sudden cardiac death, had an autopsy, and the cause of death from the autopsy is sudden cardiac death. And if we think about it, this is before the drug's approved. So this is a death in the vaccinated arm in Kansas, with an autopsy that was hidden. This death was not disclosed publicly, and this autopsy was not disclosed. And if we think about all that has happened since the vaccine rollout, this could have been something that could have, if we had done, if all regulatory authorities were working as they should have, this could have been something that if they paid more attention, a lot more things could have been prevented. Terrible things could have been prevented.
So hang on. Remember at the time of the meeting, they had 6 deaths, 4 in placebo, 2 in the group. If you add this third one, which is autopsy confirmed, we would be at 4 and 3. But your point is there was enough time for even an autopsy to be done before the data cutoff.
Absolutely.
So here's an autopsy proven vaccine death that's not in the core slides or not in the briefing booklet.
Absolutely. And there's another one. So this is now bringing it to 3. Let's go to the next slide. So this is another subject. So remember I said there were 6 deaths in the vaccinated arm. 2 were publicly disclosed. So I have documentation for 2. So this is the other one. 58-year-old subject in Georgia, took the vaccine, died on the 7th of November. And it's very clearly written that the husband informed the clinical trial site of her death on the 7th of November. So now remember, this is before the data cutoff. Now, this is a 58-year-old woman who died in her sleep. Nothing untoward happened before. She's taking all her normal medications, but she doesn't score an autopsy. She's in a clinical trial, but she doesn't score an autopsy. So this is what's happening in Georgia in 2020. And the thing that was, in the previous slide, I said that the case report form for the clinical trial site, they delayed for 37 days writing the follow-up of the patient. And only, even though the patient died on the 19th of October, they only wrote it on the 27th of November. For this patient, the clinical trial site now has documented notification of death on the 7th of November. So now, by the 8th of November, according to the rules, Pfizer should have known about this death. That's still before the data cutoff. This death should have been publicly disclosed, and it wasn't.
So the clinical trial site had this death and said, well, we have a query, let's hold it open, what have you. And, it's fine to do that while they're gathering more information, but they must report it within 24 hours to the clinical study center, the data center, and the data center must have that in the core slides and the briefing booklet. They have to do that in the study report, which the core slides and briefing booklet are made from. So now we have 4 vaccine deaths. So someone dying in their sleep is clearly consistent with vaccine myocarditis and death during the sleep, as reported by Gill and others. So now we have 4, and you're saying there's even 2 more vaccine deaths that we just don't have information on, outside the fact that they died before the data cutoff, right?
Yes.
Okay.
We don't have as good documentation. All these 2 subjects, they're separate letters with all the relevant receipts for this particular person. I'm thinking, and those letters were directed to the relevant state attorney generals.
Right.
But for the other 2, we don't have as good documentation.
Now, what about for the additional 1 in placebo who died before the data cutoff? Do we have any information on that death?
No, not as good. Not as good as these 2. The one from Georgia and Kansas. The documentation is not as. This one, it's just written there. The receipts are in plain sight. If you know the timeline and if you know things like the data cutoff, you can piece this together. And, as I have presented it this way.
So we should have had, by the time of the data cutoff, we should have had 6 deaths in Pfizer. We should have had 5 in placebo. Yep. Of the 6 deaths in Pfizer, 4 looked like they were solid vaccine deaths. 2 we don't know. And then the 5 in placebo, none of them looked suspicious, like they could, fall into a comparable category. And that's all before the data cutoff. So keep going, and then we're going to take a break for our sponsors just after the next slide.
Yeah. So, and the other thing is that when we did our peer-reviewed article, we looked at how many of them had autopsies. So when in the peer-reviewed article, remember there were 21 vaccinated deaths, 17 placebo. Of the 21 vaccinated deaths, 10 of them were sudden adult deaths. There were people who were found dead in their sleep. The mother found them dead in the laundry. They went for a walk and just died. So they were clear sudden adult deaths. That signal was already seen if you actually read through, if the regulators read through all the patient narratives, that signal was already seen. So now for the patients with sudden adult death in the vaccinated arm, the 10 of them, there were only 2 autopsies. One autopsy is the one from Kansas that was hidden. And the other one is the man, is a 57-year-old man whose mother found him dead in the laundry. He was going upstairs, downstairs. He had an autopsy, but until this day, the result is not available. All the other 8 sudden deaths, people who died, who were, the neighbors called the loved ones and said this house is smelling. So they found people dead. There were people dead on welfare checks. There were people, the other 8 sudden adult deaths, there were no autopsies. So it's not only hidden deaths, there were hardly any autopsies done. And that's important because remember my first slide, they said that none of the deaths in this trial were due to the vaccine. And on that basis, and I have written to the regulatory authorities in Australia, and I've asked the head of the TGA, because I wrote to him about the hidden deaths, and he came back and he told me clinical trials are hard. It's too hard to keep records. So there's nothing hidden. Everything's good clinical practice. But he told me it's reassuring to note that none of the deaths in the trial were due to the vaccine. And that's what made me look at this more clearly. How can it pass the pub test, a common sense test, by saying none of the deaths in the trial were due to the vaccine when there were hardly any autopsies?
Right. Well, I can tell you by convention for sure, for a drug, any death within 30 days, we attribute to the drug, because it's just,
Yes.
you can't possibly, autopsies are not done. And in a study like this, we'd want to be conservative and just assume all the deaths are due to the experimental product, because we don't want to cause harm in the population. We've been talking to Dr. Jeyanthi Kunadhasan, who's an anesthesiologist in Australia, in Victoria. And she has been part of a study team that's published a paper analyzing forensically death by death in the Pfizer clinical trials program. We're going to take a break for our sponsors right now. You've been listening to Focal Points and America Out Loud Talk News McCullough Report with a live stream, late breaking, very critical analysis. We're going to pause right here. Let's get real. Let's get loud on America Out Loud Talk Radio. This is McCullough Report. And I'm Dr. Peter McCullough in Focal Points with Nick Hulscher, probably the most exciting epidemiologist in the world right now. Nick has been breaking so many stories. And Dr. Kunadhasan, who's just recently communicated with Chris Kobach, who's the Attorney General of Kansas. And Chris has prevailed at the U.S. Supreme Court in pushing forward against Pfizer, and Pfizer committing fraud. That is not telling us the truth on these clinical trials. We've been looking at the slide now. 17 deaths in Pfizer. 21 deaths in Pfizer, 17 in placebo. Jeyanthi, at what time point does this slide indicate? At what time point?
This is still up. This is for the 6-month period. So this is the 38 subject deaths. And this is an analysis of the how many autopsies were done. Right.
So this is at 6 months. So the Verbeck meeting occurs December 10th, and this must be about another 3 months after December 10th.
Yep, up to about March. Yes.
So by this time period, at 3 months in the United States, we had about 20 million Americans vaccinated. So at this time point, the data show 21 deaths in Pfizer, 17 in placebo. So there's an excess death. And do you know, at the 3-month mark, I testified in the Texas Senate, in that 20 million Americans who took the shots, we already had 1,600 deaths reported to the VAERS system. So your forensic work, in a sense, is cohesive. Sadly, it anticipated this mortality disaster we saw with the vaccine. So let's press on with your analysis.
Thank you. So but basically, this is a summary. I've presented this at the excess mortality hearing in Australia. And it's basically a summary. So for links, if people want to know about my work, I've written to AG Ken Paxton, as well as the head of the TJ in Australia. And basically, the next slide is a continuation of all the people I've written to about the hidden deaths. And that's also a link to our 38 subject deaths, our forensic analysis paper.
So did any of these people take it seriously like they should have, or did they just ignore it?
So I haven't heard back. I hope they take it seriously, but I haven't heard back. So I appreciate this opportunity to talk about their story, because for me, the people in the clinical trial, they were the first victims of all of this. Like, imagine signing up for a trial, then you've died, you've had an autopsy, and then they hide it. Like, it's such a travesty. And for that patient in Kansas, they wrote that she died basically due to hypertension and obesity. And when I looked at her notes, nobody had even written a high blood and a blood pressure reading in her case report form. And then they said she died of obesity. She was 74 kilos. Her BMI was 27. So it's farcical. She doesn't even qualify in the criteria of the definition of obesity. This is how farcical it is. So thank you for the opportunity to tell their story, because for me, they were the first victims.
I've got a question for you. I'm about to testify in the U.S. Senate, and Nick Hulscher will be in support in just a few days. So I really want to know this information. So we had 6 deaths in Pfizer and 5 in placebo at the time of the November 15th data cutoff. How many
14.
deaths occurred from November 15th to December 10th? This is very important.
Yep.
That time period, because that time period, let me tell you, at an FDA meeting, the first question I always ask is, how many deaths have accrued from the time of the data cutoff to the time of the meeting? Because they have to be added as a little supplement to the briefing booklet. How many died in that critical period?
So I don't want to give a number, and I will get back to you and give you an exact number. I think it was 17, but don't quote me on that, and I will get back and give you an exact number.
Okay, because the 38, well, I'm sorry, the 6-month total death number, is it 38 or 44?
38.
38. So there's 38 total deaths at 6 months
period,
and they're in your slides. And a lot of people don't know, at the time of the VRBPAC meeting, the study wasn't done, it wasn't completed, it was ongoing, and they ultimately had 400 patients lost to follow-up. So there could have been many more deaths that occurred, and they have no idea. The study was closed still with a large loss to follow-up.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I can progress to the other bit of findings that I've had as well. So basically, it's topical at the moment. I've just seen a letter sent by, I think it's the GOP Judiciary Committee, ranking member Jim Jordan, to Albert Bourla, who's the head of Pfizer, basically asking if there was any, Pfizer had delayed the vaccine efficacy results around the November 2020 election. And a lot of this reporting was, there was a little bit of a snippet of this reporting that the Southern District of New York was actually investigating this. And basically what was reported in the Wall Street Journal and Reuters was there's no evidence that Pfizer delayed the vaccine results prior to the November 2020 election. So basically what I want to say is there actually is evidence, and I want to talk about it. So remember I said that the vaccine was said to be effective, 95% effective, based on the results of 170 patients. And so we found these patients. I found the patients in the trial, and it wasn't actually easy to find them. They were in the documentation that came out in PHMPT was piecemeal, and we had to thread together different documents to actually get the proper 170 list. And I want to have a shout out to my co-author Ed Clark, because when we actually got the 170 list, he cross-referenced the I'm pretty sure the 170 patients that I found is the 170 patients that Pfizer said when this vaccine is 95% effective, because we've cross-referenced their age, sex, and their body habitat status according to an appendix in the New England Journal of Medicine. So we're pretty sure our list is the correct list. So now the thing is, when were these patients diagnosed? And it'll become clear why I asked these questions, because the primary endpoint of the trial was to say that the vaccine's efficacious, you need to show that you have more infections in the placebo arm compared to the vaccine arm. And out of the 172 patients, 162 were placebo, and only 8 was in the vaccinated arm. That's how you get the 95% effective. So the endpoint of the trial was having a COVID infection. And that's what Francis Collins testified in September 9th, basically saying, this trial is so big, it's 44,000, but we're only looking for about 150 people to have COVID infections. And then we can say that whether this trial is effective or not. Now, I'm not offering any criticism about the endpoint chosen. What I've done is I've actually just found the patients and looked when they were diagnosed. And if we go to the next slide, why that's important is because this is publicly available. This is the contract between Pfizer and the Trump administration for the delivery of an efficacious vaccine by the 31st of October 2020. That's why President Trump could say that we will have a, I think there was one debate where he pretty much said we'll have a vaccine before the election, because this was the contract. Obviously at that time this contract wasn't publicly available, but so the approval was for a vaccine that was approved by the 31st of October 2020. Now, if you think about it, they only wanted a very select group of patients. This had to be patients who went through the trial perfectly, didn't have any evidence of infection prior to 7 days after dose 2, and they had no protocol deviation. So it was, even though the trial was big, it was very hard to find the primary endpoint population of this trial, the 170. So to actually deliver a vaccine by the 31st of October, they should have done the interim analysis the minute they could. And that's the next slide. They always had a plan, even though they aimed for 107. Remember, Francis Collins said he wanted about 150. Their actual aim was about 164 patients. But if you want to actually declare an efficacious vaccine as soon as possible to fulfill the contract that you've signed, you had to do the interim analysis when you reach the first threshold, and that was 32 cases. You have to do the analysis as soon as possible, because remember when Pfizer actually made the announcement, they said they only, at that point, they only had 94 cases. So they actually hadn't even reached their target, but it was the interim analysis. So what I put here is to always tell you, Pfizer always had a target number of cases. And if they reached that target, they would do an interim analysis to see if they had an efficacious vaccine. We can go to the next slide.
But did they do the interim analysis at 32 events? They did.
No, they didn't. So that's the story. That's how they delayed the announcement. So next slide. So this is the press release that Pfizer, they did the analysis on November 8th. So remember, the election was, I think it was November 3rd, right? So Joe Biden was declared president on November 7th. November 8th, Pfizer did an interim analysis. So now, even though they had a plan to do an interim analysis at 32 cases, 62 cases, they didn't follow this plan. What they said is after discussion with the FDA, they elected to drop the 32 case interim analysis and conduct the first interim analysis when they reached a minimum of 62 cases. So that's, and when they concluded those discussions, and I hope there's people ask Albert Bola, what were the operational reasons for not doing the 32 case analysis? And they said that upon conclusion of the discussions, the evaluable case count reached 94. So the only one interim analysis was done, not at 32 cases, which was the first threshold, not at 62 cases, which was the second threshold. They suddenly discussed with the FDA and did an interim analysis on November 8th when they reached 94 cases. So this is, if we didn't have access to PHMPT, this is all that we have to go by. Okay, now let's go to the next slide. So this is basically Pfizer's accrual data according to Pfizer, if we didn't know the exact 170 patients. Now, remember I said that the trial started on the 27th of July. This was a special population. The first patient could only have come from the 24th of August because he had to go through 2 doses and 7 days. So the first patient to this population could only come 24th of August. Up until period of November 8th, they said they reached 94 cases. And then suddenly data cutoff date, this is the most COVID known to man. From 94 cases, they reached 170. So that's about 10 cases a day. And this is less than a case a day. up until November 8th. And I've put 61 here. This is not something that's publicly available, but it's my derived value, and I'll explain it further. Because if we go to the next slide. Now, remember, we had the contract that said deliver vaccine by 31st of October. Pfizer's changed the protocol because this trial was ongoing. There were so many protocol changes. On the 29th of October, 2 days before the contract is due, they said for operational reasons. So I hope Congressman Jim Jordan asked Albert Bourla what exactly those operational reasons were, why they couldn't do the interim analysis at 32 cases. They will do it when they accrue at least 62. So now the contract has lapsed because you've passed 31st of October, and this contract could only be modified with the Trump administration in good faith. And in the contract, Pfizer had to notify the Trump administration if there was going to be a delay, a risk to not fulfilling this contract, even if it was a week. All right. So now this is 29th of October. They said we will do it when we get at least 62 cases. All right. So that's why when in the previous slide, I said at that point on the 31st of October, they must have had the most they would have had is 61 cases because now they couldn't fulfill the contract. And if we go to the next slide, is if you actually know the 170 patients and you actually clarify when they were diagnosed of having COVID in a central lab test, then you can see the line of accrual of the actual population of the 170 is very different and more realistic than the one that Pfizer put out. Because when they said they had 94 cases, they actually had 134. So they underrepresented 40 cases. And remember, they said they will only do an analysis when they reach at least 62 cases on the 29th of October. If they had reached 62 cases a week before on October 22nd. So even when they're amending the protocol and saying, we can't do an analysis, we don't have enough cases, we've gone past the first threshold for operational reasons with the FDA, we've had lots of discussion, we can't do the analysis. Now we'll do it when it's at least 62. They had 62 cases a week ago, and that will be quite apparent in the next slide. And this is when they actually reach the threshold. So remember I said, if you want to have an efficacious vaccine, you had to do your interim analysis as soon as you reach the first threshold. That's October 9th, because the contract asks for an approved vaccine. So you have 32 cases, you clean up your data, send it to the FDA. The FDA has to look at the data, and that's the only way that they could have actually produced a vaccine by the 31st of October, isn't it? And now let's look at the point. So when Jim Jordan actually wrote in his letter that he was wondering whether they delayed it at the risk of public health. Now let's look, and it become quite clear in the next slide as well. At this point, there were no vaccinated people. The vaccine at 32 cases was 100% effective. Was a 100% effective. There was all placebo cases. The first vaccinated person was only here. This is the 9th of October. The vaccine is 100% effective. What was the ethical justification to deny the public this 100% efficacious vaccine in the first instance? Those are the questions I hope are asked, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about it. And you know, they have to ask Albert Bourla what were the operational reasons for not doing the analysis at 32 cases. When did they have 62 cases? Because he actually had 62 cases on the 22nd of October, but they changed the protocol on the 29th of October. So it has to be asked of Pfizer, when did you reach the 62 case threshold? And the time when they said they had 94 cases, they actually had 130 plus cases. They underrepresented 40 cases.
Well, it seems to me, I've been on the data safety monitoring boards, and adjudication committees, it seems to me that what they did is they were intentionally delaying the interim analysis and trying to actually get this to ultimately happen after the election, because they didn't want Trump to be able to declare victory that there was a successful trial. So in a sense, they were concealing what looked on the surface to be a successful trial, so the Trump administration couldn't declare victory. In a sense, it was kind of a clinical trial election interference case, because they weren't being honest with the information as it was rolling out.
Absolutely. I mean, what we show is the exact 170. We've done cross references, this direction, that direction, this direction. We're pretty sure the patient population we found is the 170. And when, as I said, there shouldn't be a difference between what Pfizer said, which is this dotted red line, and what was actually accrued. Remember, the contract said, if there's even a week's delay, you have to tell us.
So Pfizer's done a lot of things that are seemingly completely wrong of what they were supposed to do.
But let me just tell you, I'll just be a devil's advocate here. When data are accruing and all these events are accruing, and you're trying to figure out when to do the interim analysis, at any time that you pull the trigger and say we're going to do the interim analysis, then you have to do a soft data lock. There has to be, people have to work with the data, and then the committee has to be scheduled in order to get together, and that scheduling takes several days or sometimes a week. So I've been on some interim analyses where we analyze this much data, but by the time we're actually working, there's much more. So it's not as instantaneous mechanistically as what people think, because it's just a matter of it's people, it's scheduling, it's committees, and there's more data reporting in. But you've presented enough here to have me conclude that they intentionally delayed interim analysis.
Absolutely. And there's a committee hearing, and they're asking about this. And so, what was reported in the Wall Street Journal and Reuters, there's no evidence. And I'm like, if it was always the 170 were the most important patients in this trial, because it's based on their results that they said they have an effective vaccine.
Now, remember, I have to get this in. Remember, the trial was not effectively blinded. So people who took the shots, they knew they took the shots because they're so toxic, they cause so much pain in the arm and fever and other symptoms. Those who got placebo knew they had placebo. And so when it's not effectively blinded, it's important to understand that those who got the active shot probably thought they were protected. So if they got some sniffles or some nasal congestion, they were less likely to go get a COVID test. But those who got placebo, they knew they weren't protected, and they were far more likely to go get a COVID test. And that's exactly what happened. That's the reason why you ended up with, these lopsided figures. What they should have done is they should have done weekly routine COVID testing, so they would be equally tested in each group.
Absolutely. But this was an analysis of the exact patient population that formed the primary endpoint for the trial, and there shouldn't have been that much discrepancy.
Right.
That's the point I wanted to.
Now, Jeyanthi, we're coming up on time. Are there more slides left? Are we okay? We've finished. Great. Well, listen, Nick, what's your perspective on what you've seen today?
I'm shocked. It appears that Pfizer literally employed over 5 tricks, over 5 methods to obscure data, to obscure deaths. If they properly did what they were supposed to do, and didn't attempt to conceal these deaths, we could have been in a much better situation today if we were properly alerted that these products were in fact causing excess deaths in the trials. Maybe they wouldn't have been administered to billions of people, or I guess Pfizer hundreds of millions. But regardless,
I can tell you, if I was on the committee, and I've been on these committees, And if I would have been presented 6 deaths in Pfizer, 5 in placebo, and I was told that there were hundreds of cases lost to follow-up at that time, I would say, listen, not approved. That the trial at least has to go on for a longer duration, and we have to ascertain, is there truly an excess mortality risk with Pfizer? And indeed, they have to, get a much better handle on loss to follow-up. But what we've seen is a whole series of actions that were in one direction to make Pfizer look safe, look efficacious, and have the results delivered after the election. And so Trump couldn't declare victory. So this is being attacked in multiple angles. This has been a great review. Thanks for everybody who joined early. I see the comments coming in. You've been listening to Focal Points, hosted by Nick Hulscher, epidemiologist and administrator of the McCullough Foundation. Of course, myself, Dr. Peter McCullough, and from Australia, who's actually joined us today from Malaysia. She's from Kuala Lumpur, Dr. Jeyanthi Kunadhasan. Dr. Hassan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.